important and unpleasant as a ticking parcel, but which nevertheless drew the eye in the same way that a really bad accident does. One felt that one would like to know their purpose, while at the same time suspecting that if you found out, you would really prefer not to have done. Simon saw her expression and hastily shut the book. "Just some magic," he mumbled. "Something I'm working," said Esk automatically. "Thank you, on." "It must be quite interesting, reading books," said Esk. "Sort of." "Can't you read, Esk?" The astonishment in his voice stung her. "I expect so," she said defiantly. "I've never tried." Esk wouldn't have known what collective man was if it had spat in her eye. But she knew there was a herd of goats and a coven of witches. She didn't know what you call for a lot of witches. An order of
Fan. Det ska inte mye snö till för den drittbilen sätter sig fast.
Whatever it was, it filled the university. Wizards strolled among the cloisters and sat on benches under the trees. Young wizards scuffled along pathways as bells rang, with their arms full of books, or, in the case of senior students, with their books flapping through the air after them. The air had the greasy feel of magic and tasted of tin. Esk walked along between Treatle and Simon and drank it all in. It wasn't just that there was magic in the air, but it was tamed and working like a mill race. It was power, but it was harnessed. Simon was as excited as she was, but it showed him because his eyes watered more and his stutter got worse. He kept stopping to point out the various colleges in the search building. One was
Fan, stoppa han mitt.
That's the library, said Simon, his voice bursting with wonder.
Han var en ganska bra bröt.
Can I have a look? Plenty of time for that later, said Treacle.
Da vi trygge.
All the books of magic everywhere.
Skulle vært 4 uttrekk på den der skjønne her.
Said Esk. Simon swallowed. Because books of magic aren't like other books. They lead a... That's enough, snapped Treacle. He looked down at Esk as if he had just noticed her and frowned. "Why are you here?" "You invited me in," said Esk. "Me? Oh, yes, of course. Sorry, I'm wandering. A young lady who wants to be a wizard. Let us see." He led the way up a broad flight of steps to an impressive pair of doors. At least they were designed to be impressive. The designer had invested deeply in heavy locks, curly hinges, brass studs, and an intricately carved archway to make it absolutely clear to anyone entering they were not very important people at all. He was a wizard. He had forgotten the doorknocker. Treacle rapped on the door with his staff. It hesitated for a while and then slowly slid back its bolts and swung open. The hall was full of wizards and boys' parents. There are 2 ways of getting into Unseen University. In fact, there are 3, but at this time wizards hadn't realised it. The first is to achieve some great work of magic, such as the recovery of an ancient and powerful relic, or the invention of a totally new spell. But in these times it was seldom done. In the past there had been great wizards capable of forming whole new spells from the chaotic raw magic of the world. Wizards from whom, as it were, all the spells of wizardry had flowed. But those days had gone. There were no more sorcerers. So the more typical method was to be sponsored by a senior and respected wizard after a suitable period of apprenticeship. Competition was stiff for a university place and the honour and privileges an unseen degree could bring. Many of the boys milling around the hall and launching minor spells at each other would fail and have to spend their lives as lowly magicians, mere magical technologists with defiant beards and leather patches on their elbows who congregated in small jealous groups at parties. Not for them, the coveted pointy hat with optional astrological symbols, or the impressive robes, or the staff of authority. But at least they could look down on conjurers, who tended to be jolly and fat and inclined to drop their H's and drink beer and go around with sad, thin women in spangly tights and really infuriate magicians by not realising how lowly they were and kept telling them jokes. Lowliest of all, apart from witches of course, were thaumaturgists, who never got any schooling at all. A thaumaturgist could just about be trusted to wash out an alembic. Many spells required things like mould from a corpse dead of crushing, or the semen of a living tiger, or the root of a plant that gave an ultrasonic scream when it was uprooted. Who was sent to get them? Right. It is a common error to refer to the lower magical ranks as hedge wizards. In fact, hedge wizardry is a very honoured and specialised form of magic that attracts silent, thoughtful men of the druidical persuasion and topiaric inclinations. If you invited a hedge wizard to a party, he would spend half the evening talking to a potted plant, and he would spend the other half listening. Esk noticed that there were some women in the hall, because even young wizards had mothers and sisters. Whole families had turned up to bid the favoured sons farewell. There was a considerable blowing of noses, wiping of tears, and the clink of coins as proud fathers tucked a little spending money into their offspring's hands. Very senior wizards were perambulating among the crowds, talking to the sponsoring wizards and examining the prospective students. Several of them pushed through the throng to meet Treacle, moving like gold-trimmed galleons under full sail. They bowed gravely to him and looked approvingly at Simon. "This is young Simon, is it?" said the fattest of them, beaming at the boy. "We've heard great reports of you, young man. Eh, what?" Simon bowed to Arch-Chancellor Cutangle, Archmage of the Wizards of the Silver Star, said Treacle. Simon bowed apprehensively. Cutangle looked at him benevolently. "We've heard great things about you, my boy," he said. "All this mountain air must be good for the brain, eh?" He laughed. The wizards around him laughed. Treacle laughed, which Esk thought was rather funny, because there wasn't anything particularly amusing happening. "I don't know From what we hear, it must be the only thing you don't know, lad," said Cutangle, his jowls waggling. There was another carefully timed bout of laughter. Cutangle patted Simon on the shoulder. "This is the scholarship, boy," he said. "Quite astounding results. Never seen better. Self-taught, too. Astonishing, what? Isn't that so, Treacle?" "Superb, Arch-Chancellor." Cutangle looked around at the watching wizards. "Perhaps you could give us a sample," he said. "A little demonstration, perhaps?" Simon looked at him in panic. "Actually, I'm not very good. Now, said Cutangle in what he probably really did think was an encouraging tone of voice. "Do not be afraid. Take your time, when you are ready." Simon licked his dry lips and gave Treacle a look of mute appeal. He said, "You..." He stopped and swallowed hard. His eyes bulged, the tears streamed from his eyes and his shoulders heaved. Treacle patted him reassuringly on the back. "Hay fever," he explained. "Don't seem to be able to cure it. Tried everything." Simon swallowed, nodded. He waved Treacle away with his long white hands and closed his eyes. For a few seconds nothing happened. He stood with his lips moving soundlessly, and then silence spread out from him like candlelight. Ripples of noiselessness washed across the crowds in the hall, striking the walls with all the force of a blown kiss, and then curling back in waves. People watched their companions, mouthing silently, and then went red with effort when their own laughter was as audible as a gnat's squeak. Tiny motes of light whimpered into existence around his head. They whirled and spiraled in a complex three-dimensional dance, and then formed a shape. In fact, it seemed to Esk that the shape had been there all the time, waiting for her eyes to see it, in the same way that a perfectly innocent cloud can suddenly become, without changing in any way, a whale or a ship or a face. The shape around Simon's head was the world. That was quite clear. although the glitter and rush of the little lights blurred some of the detail. But there was great Mantuan, the sky turtle, with the 4 elephants on its back, and on them the disc itself. There was the sparkle of the great waterfall around the edge of the world, and there at the very hub, a tiny needle of mountain Celestine, where the gods lived. The image expanded and honed in on the circled sea, and then on Ankh itself, the little lights flowing away from Simon and winking out of existence a few feet from his head. Now they showed the city from the air, rushing towards the watchers. There was the university itself growing larger. There was the great hall. There were the people watching silent and open-mouthed, and Simon himself, outlined in specks of silver light, and a tiny spot in image in the air around. And that image contained an image and another and another. There was a feeling that the universe had been turned inside out in all dimensions at once. It was a bloated, swollen sensation. It sounded as though the whole world had said, bloop. The walls faded, so did the floor. Paintings of former great mages, all scrolls and beards and slightly constipated frowns, vanished. The tiles underfoot, a rather nice black and white pattern, evaporated, to be replaced by fine sand, grey as moonlight and cold as ice. Strange and unexpected stars glittered overhead. On the horizon were low hills, eroded not by this place, but by the soft sandpaper of time itself. No one else seemed to have noticed. No one else, in fact, seemed alive. Esk was surrounded by people as still and silent as statues. And they weren't alone. There were other things behind them, and more were appearing all the time. They had no shape, or rather they seemed to be taking their shapes at random from a variety of creatures. They gave the impression that they had heard about arms and legs and jaws and claws and organs, but didn't really know how they all fitted together, or didn't care, or were so hungry they hadn't bothered to find out. They made a sound like a swarm of flies. They were the creatures out of her dreams, out to feed magic. She knew they weren't interested in her now, except in the mutual and half-the dinner meat. Their whole concentration was focused on Simon, who was totally unaware of their presence. Esk kicked him smartly on the ankle. The cold desert vanished. The real world rushed back. Simon opened his eyes, smiled faintly, and gently fell backwards into Esk's arms. A buzz went up from the wizards, and several of them started to clap. No one seemed to have noticed anything odd from the silver lights. Q-Tangle shook himself and raised a hand to quell the crowd.
Astonishing, he said to Treacle. You say he worked it out all by himself.
Indeed.
No one helped him at all.
There was no one to help him, said Treacle. He was just wandering from village to village, doing small spells, but only if people paid him in books or gold. Q-Tangle nodded.
It was no illusion, he said, yet he didn't use his hands. What was he saying to himself, do you know? What was he saying to himself, do you know?
He says it's just words to make his mind work properly, said Treacle, and shrugged. I can't understand half of what he says, and that's a fact. He says he's having to invent words because they aren't me for the things he's doing. Q-Tangle glanced sideways at his fellow mages. They nodded.
It would be an honour to admit him to the university, he said. Perhaps you would tell him so someday.
He felt a tugging at his robe and looked down. Excuse me, said Esk.
Hello, young lady,
said Q-Tangle in a sugar mouse voice.
Have you come to see your brother into the university?
He's not my brother, said Esk. There were times when the world had seemed to be full of brothers, but this wasn't one of them. Are you important? She said. Q-Tangle looked at his colleagues and beamed. There were fashions in wizardry, just like anything else. Sometimes wizards were thin and gaunt and talked to animals. The animals didn't listen, but it's the thought that counts. While at other times they tended towards the dark and saturnine with little black pointed beards. Currently Aldermanic was in. Cutangle swelled with modesty.
Quite important, he said. One does one's best in the service of one's fellow man, yes. Quite important, I would say.
I want to be a wizard, said Esk. The lesser wizards behind Cutangle stared at her as if she was a new and interesting kind of beetle. Cutangle's face went red and his eyes bulged. He looked down at Esk and seemed to be holding his breath. Then he started to laugh. It started somewhere down in his extensive stomach regions and worked its way up, echoing from rib to rib and causing minor wizard quakes across his chest until it burst forth in a series of strangled snorts. It was quite fascinating to watch, that laugh. It had a personality all of its own. But he stopped when he saw Esk stare. If the laugh was a music hall clown, then Esk's determined squint was a whitewash bucket on a fast trajectory.
A wizard, he said. You want to be a wizard?
Yes, said Esk, pushing the dazed Simon into Treatle's reluctant arms. I'm the 8th son of an 8th daughter. The wizards around her were looking at one another and whispering. Esk tried to ignore them. What did she say?
Is she serious?
I always think children are so delightful at that age, don't you?
You're the 8th son of an 8th daughter, said Cutangle. Really?
The other way round, only not exactly, said Esk defiantly. Cutangle dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief.
This is quite fascinating, he said. I don't think I've ever heard of something quite like this before, eh?
He looked around, growing audience. The people see Esk craving to check what interesting magic was going on. Was at a loss.
Well, you want to be a wizard?
I keep telling everyone, but no one seems to listen, said Esk.
How old are you, little girl?
9.
And you want to be a wizard when you grow up?
I want to be a wizard now, said Esk firmly. This is the right place, isn't it? Cutangle looked at Treacle and winked. I saw that, said Esk.
I don't think there's ever been a lady wizard before, said Cutangle. I rather think it might be against the law. Wouldn't you rather be a witch? I understand it's a fine career for girls.
The minor wizard behind him started to laugh. Esk gave him a look. Being a witch is quite good, she conceded, but I think wizards have more fun. What do you think?
I think you are a very singular little girl, said Cutangle.
What does that mean?
It means there's only one of you, said Treacle.
That's right, said Esk, and I still want to be a wizard. Words failed Cutangle.
Well, you can't, he said. The very idea.
He drew himself up to his full width and turned away. Something tugged at his robe. Why not? Said a voice. He turned.
Because, he said slowly and deliberately, because the whole idea is completely laughable. That's why. And it's absolutely against the law.
But I can do wizard magic, said Esk, the faintest suggestion of a tremble in her voice. Cutangle bent down until his face was level with hers. No, you can't, he hissed, because you are not a wizard. Women aren't wizards. Do I make myself clear? Watch, said Esk. She extended her right hand with the fingers spread and sighted along it until she spotted the statue of Malik the Wise, the founder of the university. Instinctively, the wizards between her and it edged out of the way, and then felt rather silly. I mean it, she said.
Go away, little girl,
said Cutangle. Right, said Esk. She squinted hard at the statue. and concentrated. The great doors of Unseen University are made of octaron, a metal so unstable that it can only exist in a universe saturated with raw magic. They are impregnable to all force save magic. No fire, no battering ram, no army can breach them. Which is why most ordinary visitors to the university use the back door, which is made of perfectly normal wood and doesn't go around terrorizing people or even stand still terrorizing people. It had a proper knocker and everything. Granny examined the doorposts carefully and gave a grunt of satisfaction when she spotted what she was looking for. She hadn't doubted that it would be there, cunningly concealed by the natural grain of the wood. She grasped the knocker, which was shaped like a dragon's head, and rapped smartly 3 times. After a while the door was opened by a young woman with her mouth full of clothes pegs. "Oh, who on?" she inquired. Granny bowed, giving the girl a chance to take in the pointy black hat with the batwing hatpins. It had an impressive effect. She blushed and, peering out into the quiet alleyway, hurriedly motioned Granny inside. There was a big mossy courtyard on the other side of the wall, crisscrossed with washing lines. Granny had the chance to become one of the very few women to learn what it really is that wizards wear under their robes, but modestly averted her eyes and followed the girl across the flagstones and down a wide flight of steps. They led into a long, high tunnel lined with archways and, currently, full of steam. Granny caught sight of long lines of wash tubs in the big rooms off to the sides. The air had the warm, fat smell of ironing. A gaggle of girls carrying wash baskets pushed past her and hurried up the steps, then stopped halfway up and turned slowly to look at her. Granny set her shoulders back and tried to look as mysterious as possible. Her guide, who still hadn't got rid of her clothes pegs, led her down a side passage into a room that was a maze of shelves piled with laundry. In the very centre of the maze, sitting at a table, was a very fat woman with a ginger wig. She had been writing in a very large laundry book. It was still open in front of her, but was currently inspecting a large stained vest. "Have you tried bleaching?" she asked. "Yes, mum," said the maid beside her. "What about tincture of mirrit?" "Yes, mum, it just turned it blue, mum." "Well, it's a new one on me," said the laundry woman, "and I have seen brimstone and soot and dragon blood and demon blood and I don't know what else." She turned the vest over and read the name tape carefully sewn inside. Grandpony the White. He's going to be Grandpony the Grey if he doesn't take better care of his laundry. I tell you, girl, a white magician is just a black magician with a good housekeeper. She caught sight of Yes, thank you, Cassandra, you may go, said the fat woman. She stood up and beamed at Granny, and with an almost perceptible click, wound her voice up several social classes. "Pray excuse us," she said. "You find us all at 6s and 7s, it being washing day and everything. Is this a courtesy call, or may I make so bold as to ask?" She lowered her voice. "Is there a message from the other side?" Granny looked blank, but only a fraction of a second. The witch marks on the doorpost had said that the housekeeper welcomed witches, and was particularly anxious for news of her 4 husbands. She was also in random pursuit of a 5th, hence the ginger wig, and, if Granny's ears weren't deceiving her, the creak of enough whalebone to infuriate an entire ecology movement. Gullible and foolish, the signs had said. Granny withheld judgment, because city witches didn't seem that bright themselves. The housekeeper must have mistaken her expression. "Don't be afraid," she said. "May staff have distinct instructions to welcome witches, although of course they upstairs don't approve. No doubt you would like a cup of tea and something to eat." Granny bowed solemnly. "And I will see if we can't find a nice bundle of old clothes for you too." The housekeeper beamed. Old clothes? Oh, yes, thank you, ma'am. The housekeeper swept forward with a sound like an elderly tea clipper in a gale and beckoned Granny to follow her. I'll have the tea brought to my flat. Tea with a lot of tea leaves. Granny stumped along after her. Old clothes? Did this fat woman really mean it? The nerve! Of course, if they were good quality. There seemed to be a whole world under the university. It was a maze of cellars, cold rooms, still rooms, kitchens and sculleries, and every inhabitant was either coming around and shouting. Granny caught glimpses of rooms full of ice, and others glowing with the heat from red-hot cooking stoves wall-sized. Bakeries smelled of new bread, and tap rooms smelled of old beer. Everything smelled of sweat and wood smoke. The housekeeper led her up an old spiral staircase and unlocked the door with one of the large number of keys that hung from her belt. The room inside was pink and frilly. There were frills on things that no one in their right mind would frill. It was like being inside candy floss. Very nice, said Granny, and because she felt it was expected of her. Tasteful. She looked around for something unfrilly to sit on and gave up. Whatever am I thinking of? The housekeeper trilled. I'm Mrs. Whitlow, but I expect you know, of course, and I have the honour to be addressing... Eh? Oh, Granny Weatherwax, said Granny. Frills were getting to her. They gave Pink a bad name. I'm psychic myself, of course, said Mrs. Whitlow. Granny had nothing against fortune-telling, provided it was done badly by people with no talent for it. It was a different matter if people who ought to know better did it, though. She considered that the future was a frail enough thing at best, and if people looked at it hard, they changed it. Granny had some quite complex theories about space and time and why they shouldn't be tinkered with, but fortunately good fortune-tellers were rare, and any who could be relied upon for all about bad fortune-telling. It was harder than the real thing. You needed a good imagination. She couldn't help wondering if Mrs. Whitlow was a born witch who somehow missed her training. She was certainly laying siege to the future. There was a crystal ball under a sort of pink frilly tea cosy, and several sets of divinatory cards, and a pink velvet bag of rune stones, and one of those little tables on wheels that no prudent witch would with a 10-foot point. Some dried llama turds from a monastery, which apparently could be thrown in such a way as to reveal the sum total of knowledge and wisdom in the universe. It was all rather sad. Oh, there's the tea leaves, of course, said Mrs. Whitlow, indicating the big brown pot on the table between them. I know witches often prefer them, but they always seem so, well, common to me. No offence meant at that, thought Granny. Mrs. Whitlow was giving her the sort of look generally used by puppies when they're not sure what to expect next and are beginning to worry that it may be the rolled-up newspaper. She picked up Mrs. Whitlow's cup and had started to peer into it when she caught the disappointed expression that floated across the housekeeper's face like a shadow across a snowfield. Then she remembered what she was doing and turned the cup widdershins 3 times, made a few vague passes over it and mumbled a charm, which she normally used to cure mastitis in elderly goats, but never mind. This display of obvious magical talent seemed to cheer up Mrs. Whitlow no end. Granny wasn't normally very good at tea leaves, but she squinted at the sugar-encrusted mess at the bottom of the cup and let her mind wander. What she really needed now was a handy rat, or even a cockroach that happened to be somewhere near Esk, so that she could borrow its mind. What Granny actually found was that the university had a mind of its own. It is well known that stone can think, because the whole of electronics is based on that fact. But in some universes, men spend ages looking for other intelligences in the sky without once looking under their feet. That is because they've got the time span all wrong. From Stone's point of view, the universe is hardly created, and mountain ranges are bouncing up and down like organ stops, while continents zip backwards and forwards in general high spirits, crashing into each other from the sheer joy of momentum and getting their rocks off. It is going to be quite some time before Stone notices its disfiguring little skin disease and starts to scratch, which is just as well. The rocks from which Unseen University was built, however, have been absorbing magic for several thousand years, and all that random power has had to go somewhere. The university has, in fact, developed a personality. Granny could sense it like a big and quite friendly animal just waiting to roll over on its roof and have its floor scratched. It was paying no attention to her, however. It was watching Esk. Granny found the child by following the threads of the university's attention and watched in fascination as the scenes unfolded in the Great Hall. In there? The voice came from a long way away. I said, what do you see in there? Repeated Mrs. Whitlow. Eh? I said, what do... Oh. Granny reeled her mind in, quite confused. The trouble with borrowing another mind was you always felt out of place when you got back to your own body, and Granny was the first person ever to read the mind of a building. Now she was feeling big and gritty and full of passages. Are you right? To concentrate on the tiny cup held in her pillars. Fortunately, Mrs. Whitlow put her plaster complexion and stony silence down to occult powers at work, while Granny found that a brief exposure to the vast silicon memory of the university had quite stimulated her imagination. In a voice like a drafty corridor, which made the housekeeper very impressed, she wove a future full of keen young men fighting for Mrs. Whitlow's ample favours. She also spoke very quickly, because what she had seen in the Great Hall made her anxious to go around to the main gates again. There is another thing, she added. Yes. I see you hiring a new servant. You do hire the servants here, don't you? Right. And this one is a young girl, very economical, very good worker, can turn her hand to anything. What about her then? Said Mrs. Whitlow, already savouring Granny's surprisingly graphic descriptions of her future and drunk with curiosity. The spirits are a little unclear on this point, said Granny, but it is very important that you hire her. No problem there, said Mrs. Whitlow. Can't keep servants here, you know, not for long. It's all the magic. It leaks down here, you know. Especially from the library, where they keep all them magical books. Two of the top floor maids walked out yesterday, actually. They said they were fed up going to bed, not knowing what shape they would wake up in the morning. The senior wizards turned them back, you know, but it's not the same. Yes, well, the spirits say this young lady won't be any trouble as far as that is concerned, said Granny grimly. If she can sweep and scrub, she's welcome, I'm sure, said Mrs. Whitlow, looking puzzled. She even brings her own broom. According to the spirits, that is. How very helpful. When is this young lady going to arrive? Oh, soon. That's what the spirits say. A faint suspicion clouded the housekeeper's face. This ain't the sort of thing spirits normally say. Where do they say that exactly? Here, said Granny. Look, the little cluster of tea leaves between the sugar and this crack here. Am I right? Their eyes met. Mrs. Whitlow might have had her weaknesses, but she was quite tough enough to rule the below-stairs world of the university. However, Granny could outstare a snake. After a few seconds, the housekeeper's eyes began to water. Yes, I expect you are, she said meekly, and fished a handkerchief from the recesses of her bosom. Well then, said Granny, sitting back and replacing the teacup in its saucer. There are plenty of opportunities here for a young woman willing to work hard, said Mrs. Whitlow. I myself started as a maid, you know. We all do, said Granny vaguely. And now I must be going. She stood up and reached for her hat. But must hurry, urgent appointment, said Granny over her shoulder as she hurried down the steps. There's a bundle of old clothes. Granny paused, her instincts battling for mastery. Any black velvet? Yes, and some silk. Granny wasn't sure she approved of silk. She'd heard it came out of a caterpillar's bottom, but black velvet had a powerful attraction. Loyalty won. Put it on one side, I may call again, she shouted and ran down the corridor. Cooks and scullery maids darted for cover as the old woman pounded along the slippery flagstones, leapt up the stairs to the courtyard and skidded out into the lane, her shawl flying out behind her and her boots striking sparks.
Well, I'm turning
from
off the
cobbles.